The groan of the iron wheels slowing was a sound of finality, a long, mournful sigh that echoed the despair in Evelyn Whitmore's own heart. The train, a great black beast panting steam, shuddered to a halt, and with it, the last of her forward momentum ceased. For 3 days, the constant motion had been a comfort, a delusion that she was still moving toward a future of her own making. But now, stopped dead in the heart of Montana, the illusion evaporated under the hard, white glare of the sun. The place was called Bitter Creek. The name felt less like a designation and more like a diagnosis of her own soul. She waited for the other passengers to disembark, the rough-looking men in dusty hats and the weary-faced women with children in tow, their voices a coarse murmur against the sudden, vast silence of the prairie. Each moment she remained in the carriage was a moment she did not have to face him, a moment she could still pretend this was all a terrible dream. But the air in the car grew stale and hot, thick with the scent of coal smoke and confinement. Her aunt's voice, sharp and relentless, echoed in her memory. "You have no other prospects. Evelyn, your name is tarnished here. This is a chance for a respectable life, a home. You must take it." A respectable life. The words were a mockery. What was respectable about selling oneself, sight unseen, to a stranger in a God-forsaken wilderness? It was a transaction born of desperation, a last desperate bid to escape the whispers and the pitying glances that had followed her for 2 years in Baltimore. She had been ruined, they said, not by her own actions, but by her own foolish heart, which was, in the eyes of society, a distinction without a difference. Taking a deep, steadying breath that her corset fought with every inch of whalebone, she finally stood. She smoothed the front of her dark wool travel gown, a garment utterly unsuited for this climate, its high collar choking her, its many layers a sweltering prison. She pulled on her kid gloves, stretching the soft leather over each finger with deliberate care. They were a shield, a thin but necessary barrier between her skin and the grit of this new world. With her reticule clutched in one hand and her spine as straight as a steel rod, Evelyn Whitmore, 26 years old and feeling ancient, stepped down from the train and onto the splintered wood of the platform. The heat was a physical blow. The dust, a fine, pale powder the color of bone, was everywhere. It coated the raw lumber of the buildings, settled in a haze against the impossibly vast blue sky, and instantly began to work its way into the seams of her boots. The town of Bitter Creek was little more than a single, wide street lined with a handful of false-fronted structures, a general store, a saloon from which the tinny sound of a piano drifted, a blacksmith's forge ringing with the rhythmic clang of a hammer. It was a place that seemed to have been clawed from the unforgiving earth only moments before, and looked as though it could be swallowed back up just as quickly. Men stopped their conversations to watch her, their gazes lingering, bold and appraising. She lifted her chin, her expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference, and scanned the few faces on the platform. She was looking for a man who fit the spare description her aunt had provided from his letters. A rancher, name of Calder. She saw him almost at once. He was not looking at her, but at the train itself, as if willing it to produce the person he was waiting for. He stood apart from the others, a solitary figure who seemed to possess a stillness the rest of the world lacked. He was tall, taller than any man she had known back east, and lean in the way of a wolf or a hunting hound, all long bone and sinew beneath a faded blue workshirt and canvas trousers. His face was angled and weathered, turned the color of dark honey by a relentless sun, and his hair, a deep brown, was shaggy and long. Touching the collar of his shirt, he was not handsome in the refined, clean-shaven way of the men in Baltimore. His was a stark, severe beauty forged by hardship and open spaces. Even from a distance, he radiated a quiet, unyielding strength that was as intimidating as it was undeniable. As she hesitated, he finally turned his head, and his eyes found hers, They were a startling shade of gray, the color of a stormy sky over the ocean, and they held her gaze without apology. He took in her gloves, her gown, her rigid posture, and a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps disappointment, crossed his features before it was gone, replaced by a neutral calm. He moved toward her, his stride long and unhurried. "Miss Whitmore?" he asked. His voice was low and carried a rough, gravelly texture, the sound of a man who did not speak often. "I am," she replied, her own voice coming out thinner than she would have liked. "And you are Mr. Calder?" "Luke Calder," he confirmed with a slight nod. He did not offer to shake her gloved hand, for which she was grateful. His gaze dropped to her two large trunks sitting on the platform. "Is this all of it?" "It is. The wagon's this way." He gestured with his head toward the end of the street, where a sturdy farm wagon was hitched to a pair of broad-backed horses. Beside it was a smaller, lighter buckboard, clearly meant for faster travel. He seemed about to turn when she spoke again, the words rehearsed and cold. "Mr. Calder, I would prefer to ride in the buckboard, alone." He stopped and turned back to her, his gray eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her face. The request was a clear and deliberate line drawn in the dust between them. It was a declaration of terms, a refusal of even the smallest intimacy of a shared wagon seat. She saw him process the insult, saw the muscle in his jaw tense for a fraction of a second. She braced herself for an argument, for the rough dismissal she felt was an inevitable part of this raw country. Instead, he simply gave another slow nod, "As you wish." He loaded her trunks onto the larger wagon, lifting them as if they weighed nothing, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining against the worn fabric of his shirt. He secured them with rope, his movements economical and precise. He then untied the buckboard's reins and handed them to her. "Can you manage a team?" he asked, his tone devoid of any judgment. "I am perfectly capable of driving, Mr. Calder," she said stiffly. "The trail to the ranch is clear. Just follow me. It is about a 2-hour ride." He swung himself up onto the seat of the main wagon with a fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime of such movements. He did not look back at her as he clicked his tongue, setting his team into a slow, steady walk, left alone on the platform. Evelyn felt a strange, unsettling mix of victory and foolishness. She had established her independence, but the act left her feeling profoundly and terribly alone. With a deep sigh, she gathered her skirts, climbed onto the hard seat of the buckboard, and snapped the reins, the small horse lurching forward in a cloud of that ever-present dust. The journey to his ranch was a silent procession through a world larger and emptier than anything she had ever imagined. The sky was not a ceiling, but an endless, aching void. The land rolled on in waves of brown grass and gray-green sagebrush, broken only by distant, hazy mountains that looked like sleeping giants. There were no trees to speak of, save for a few gnarled cottonwoods huddled along the banks of a dry creek bed. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses' hooves. It was a silence that pressed in on her, forcing her to confront the enormity of her decision. She watched the man ahead of her, a dark silhouette against the horizon. He never looked back. His posture was relaxed but alert, his connection to the land and his animals seamless and natural. He belonged here. She was an ink stain on a clean page, dark, formal, and utterly out of place. It was during that long, hot ride that she found the resolve to say what must be said. She could not allow him to harbor any illusions about the nature of their arrangement. When they finally arrived, the ranch was much as she had pictured it, and yet worse. It sat in a wide, lonely valley, a collection of humble buildings dwarfed by the landscape. The main house was a simple log structure, sturdy but without a single concession to beauty. There was a large barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings, but a great, black scar marred the land near the house. The charred timbers of what must have been another building lay in a heap, and the earth around it was scorched and barren. It gave the whole place an air of tragedy, of a wound that had not yet healed. Luke pulled his wagon to a stop before the house and was on the ground before the wheels had fully ceased to turn. He waited for her to approach. She drew the buckboard to a halt and sat for a moment, gripping the reins, gathering her courage. "Mr. Calder," she began, before he could move to help her down. He stopped, turning his full attention to her. "Miss Whitmore, before I step foot in that house, it is imperative that we establish a clear understanding of my presence here." Her voice was high and formal, the voice she used when addressing tradesmen or inferiors. She hated the sound of it, but it was her only armor. He remained silent, his expression unreadable. Waiting. "I have come to Montana because of pressure from my family," she stated, the words tasting like ash. "My circumstances left me with few alternatives. I will honor the agreement in principle. I will perform the duties of a housekeeper and a partner in this enterprise, as your letters proposed. However, I will not share your bed." She felt a hot blush creep up her neck but forced herself to meet his gaze. "Any physical intimacy is out of the question. I expect that any marriage ceremony will be delayed for a respectable period, to allow us to become acquainted. These are my terms." She finished, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected anger, outrage. He had paid her passage, had expected a wife in full. He had every right to send her back on the next train. She watched his face, searching for the explosion she was sure would come. Luke Calder simply stood there in the dust and the silence, the sun beating down on his bare head. He looked at her for a long time, his gray eyes seeming to see right through the protective shell she had so carefully constructed. He saw the fear beneath the pride, the desperation behind the demands. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, without a trace of anger. "I buried my younger brother 3 months ago," he said, his gaze shifting to the empty expanse of the porch. "Fever took him. The fire took the old barn a month before that. This has been a hard year. Miss Whitmore, I sent for a partner, not a bed warmer. The house is quiet, too quiet." He looked back at her. "Your terms are acceptable. You will have your own room and your own time." With that, he turned and began to unhitch his team, his movements as steady and deliberate as before. Evelyn was left speechless. His calm acceptance was more disorienting than any argument. He had agreed without protest, his quiet dignity stripping her of her righteous defiance and leaving her feeling small and shrewish. He had not asked for a wife. He had asked for a partner to share the silence, and his own sorrow, plainly stated, made her own feel selfish and small. Shakily, she climbed down from the buckboard, her legs stiff from the ride. The house, when she finally entered, was as stark as the man who owned it. It was clean, but relentlessly masculine. The main room served as a kitchen and sitting area, dominated by a large stone fireplace and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. There was a single bedroom off to one side. Its door opened to reveal a simple rope bed and a small chest. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a place for survival, not living. The silence inside was even more profound than it had been outside. It was the silence of loss, heavy and suffocating. "The well is out back," Luke said from the doorway. "The necessary is behind the barn. I'll bring your trunks in." His kindness, so simple and direct, unnerved her. She had prepared for a battle against a coarse, demanding man. She had no defenses against a gentle one. He placed her trunks at the foot of the bed in the single bedroom. "This will be your room for now," he said, and then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet house that was to be her new home. She stood in the middle of the floor and felt a wave of such profound desolation that her knees nearly buckled. There was no one here to talk to, no female face to offer a moment of shared understanding. no buffer between her and the vast, empty landscape, and the equally vast, empty silence of the man who was to be her husband. That night, after a simple, mostly silent meal of beans and salted pork, the weight of it all became too much to bear. She could not stay in that house, in that room that was his but was now hers. She felt like an intruder, a ghost. The air was thick with the memories of the brother he had lost. She needed to escape, to breathe. She found herself drawn to the barn. The air inside was warm and smelled sweetly of hay and animals. It was a living place, unlike the house. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft and sank down into the loose straw, hidden in the shadows. From here, through a gap in the wooden slats, she could see the house, a single square of yellow light shining from the main room window. And in that solitary square of light, she saw his silhouette as he sat at the table, his head bowed. The loneliness of his posture mirrored her own, and it broke something inside her. She pulled the letter from her reticule, the paper soft and worn from countless readings. It was not a love letter. It was a final, dismissive note from Arthur, the man who had whispered promises of marriage in Baltimore, who had taken her innocence in a moonlit garden, and who had then laughed with his friends about the foolish, plain girl who had believed him. The humiliation was a physical pain, a festering wound that had never been allowed to heal. Being sent here, to this mail-order arrangement, was the final confirmation of her ruin. She was no longer fit for a proper marriage, only for a bargain made in desperation. A sob escaped her, thick and ragged. She pressed her face into the hay, muffling the sound, and let the tears come, hot and cleansing, weeping for the girl she had been, for the love she had thought was real, and for the shame that had become her constant companion. From the darkened porch of the house, Luke Calder watched the barn. He had seen her slip out, a fleeting shadow in the moonlight. He could not hear her, but he could feel her sorrow, as if it were a drop in the temperature of the night air. He knew what it was to weep alone, to be consumed by a grief so large it felt like it would swallow you whole. His first instinct was to go to her, to offer a clumsy word of comfort, but he stopped himself. He remembered the look on her face on the station platform, the rigid set of her jaw. She was a woman who guarded her pain like a fortress. Pushing at the gates would only make her build them higher. She needed space. She needed safety. He did not go to her. Instead, he stayed on the porch for a long time, a silent guardian in the darkness, giving her the only thing he could, the gift of being left alone. The next morning, she awoke to the sound of a hammer. It was a steady, rhythmic sound. Thump, thump, thump. Pause, thump, thump, thump. She dressed and went outside, her eyes gritty from a sleepless night. She saw him beside the main house, working in the early morning light. He had already laid a foundation of fresh-cut logs and was now framing a small addition onto the side of the cabin, right next to his own room. He worked without a shirt, his back and shoulders a landscape of taut muscle that moved with an easy, powerful rhythm. He was building her a room, a separate room, with its own door, attached to the house but not a part of its main living space. It was a physical manifestation of the promise he had made. He was giving her space, building it for her with his own two hands. With lumber he had likely milled himself. The gesture was so profound, so deeply respectful of the boundaries she had drawn, that it left her breathless. He had not just heard her terms, he had honored them in the most tangible way imaginable. A week later, they rode into Bitter Creek for supplies. As Luke loaded sacks of flour and sugar into the wagon, Evelyn went into the general store to purchase thread and needles. Two women stood by the counter, their heads close together, their voices a low buzz of gossip. They fell silent as she approached, their eyes taking in her plain but well-made dress, a clear sign of her Eastern origins. She made her purchase, her cheeks burning under their scrutiny. As she turned to leave, she heard one of them whisper to the other, the words sharp and clear in the small store. "That's the one. Calder's mail-order pride. They say she won't even let him touch her." Sleeps in a room he built on the side of the house like a hired girl." The other woman sniffed contemptuously. "Too proud, if you ask me. A woman who comes all this way alone makes you wonder. I'll wager she's not as innocent as she pretends to be." The word struck Evelyn like a physical blow, confirming her deepest, most secret fear, that her shame was visible, a stain that everyone could see. She did not look at them. She kept her head high, her back ramrod straight, and walked out of the store without a word. But as she climbed back onto the buckboard for the silent ride home, she felt a coldness settle deep within her. The world was a cruel and judging place, here just as it had been in Baltimore. The kindness of the quiet man beside her was an anomaly, an island in an ocean of contempt, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was safer to remain on her own small, fortified island than to ever risk stepping into the water again. She felt the wall around her heart, which had perhaps begun to soften, turn to ice. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Evelyn, hardened by the overheard cruelty in town, threw herself into her work with a silent, ferocious energy. It was a way to fill the vast, empty hours and to keep from thinking. She scrubbed the floors of the small cabin until the pine boards were pale and fragrant. She baked bread that filled the quiet house with a scent of home she herself did not feel. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, the way it needed to be coaxed and fed just so. She washed their clothes with harsh lye soap that reddened her hands, and she mended Luke's worn shirts and canvas trousers with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She fed the chickens, scattering grain with a flick of her wrist, finding a strange comfort in their simple, clucking greed. She learned to patch the worn leather of a saddle blanket, pushing the heavy needle through the tough material with a thimble and a grim determination. These were tasks she could understand, tasks that had a clear beginning and a satisfying end. They were her territory, a small domestic kingdom she could control. But she drew a firm line at the barn. The raw, elemental nature of animal life disturbed her. One cool spring morning, Luke found her by the well as he came from the barn, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. "The brindle cow is calving," he said, his voice even. "She's having a hard time of it. The calf is turned wrong. I could use another pair of hands." Evelyn pictured it immediately. The straining, the sounds, the blood. A wave of revulsion washed over her. It felt too intimate, too base. It was a reminder of the body, of functions and fluids she had spent years trying to pretend did not exist. "I cannot," she said, her voice tight. She could not bring herself to look at him. That is base labor. It is not something a lady is expected to assist with." She felt the silence stretch between them, heavy with her refusal. She expected a sharp retort, a command. He was the man here, the rancher. She was the woman who had agreed to be his partner. But when he spoke, his voice was just tired. "All right, Evelyn." He turned and walked back into the barn without another word. For the rest of the morning, she heard the distressed lowing of the cow, a sound of profound, animal agony. She tried to block it out by kneading bread with a punishing force, but the sound seeped through the walls of the cabin. Hours later, Luke emerged, his arms smeared with blood to the shoulders, his face grim with exhaustion. He carried a pail to the well and began to methodically wash himself, the water turning pink and then red around his hands. He had saved the calf, but the cow had been lost. He did not speak of it, and his silence was a heavier judgment than any angry words could have been. The unspoken tension between them lasted for days. Then the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the weather broke. The storm came on fast, a wall of dark cloud that raced across the prairie and swallowed the sun. The wind rose to a mournful shriek, bending the tall grasses flat against the earth. Evelyn was in the cabin, watching through the window as the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the dusty ground. Turning it dark, she noticed the wood box beside the stove was nearly empty. It was a small oversight, but in her current state of mind, it felt like a failure. Determined to prove her worth, to contribute something beyond the walls of the house, she pulled on a heavy shawl and hurried outside. The wind tore at her, whipping her skirts around her legs and plastering loose strands of hair to her cheeks. The air was electric, charged with the smell of rain and damp earth. She kept her head down against the gale, making her way toward the wood pile stacked against the side of the barn. The rain came harder now, a cold, driving deluge that soaked her shawl in seconds. She gathered an armful of split logs, the rough bark scraping her skin, and turned to head back. That was when she heard the roar, the small, placid creek that ran through the valley. Normally a gentle stream she could step across, had become a churning, brown monster. Fed by the downpour, it had swollen its banks and was now a raging torrent, carrying rocks and debris in its violent current. Her path back to the house was cut off. She hesitated, looking for another way, and took a step along the slick, muddy bank. Her foot slipped. With a cry of alarm, she fell, sliding down the muddy incline toward the churning water. She clawed at the mud, her fingers finding no purchase. The cold, greedy water licked at the hem of her dress, pulling at her, threatening to drag her in. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Suddenly, a hand clamped around her arm like a band of iron. Luke was there, appearing out of the gray curtain of rain as if summoned by her fear. He had one arm wrapped around the base of a small, sturdy sapling, and the other was stretched out to her. His face was a mask of grim urgency. He pulled, his muscles straining, and she felt herself being hauled up the slippery bank, away from the hungry water. He did not let go when she was on solid ground. He pulled her flush against him, his arm wrapping around her waist, holding her steady. She was soaked to the bone, shivering violently from the cold and the shock. He was just as wet, his shirt plastered to the hard planes of his chest. The heat of his body was a stark contrast to the icy rain. For a moment, she sagged against him, grateful, terrified, her face pressed into the rough, wet wool of his shirt. He was solid and real and safe. "Are you all right?" he shouted over the wind, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She could only nod, her teeth chattering. He began to half-drag, half-carry her toward the house, his grip proprietary and strong. But as the initial shock wore off, a new kind of panic set in. The feeling of his body against hers, the solid wall of his chest, the powerful arm locked around her waist. It was too close, too male. It was the kind of proximity she had fought so hard to avoid. The memory of another man's hands, another man's embrace that had led to her ruin, rose up like bile in her throat. As they reached the relative shelter of the porch, he brought her closer still, trying to shield her from the wind, to warm her with his own body heat. It was a practical, necessary gesture, but she could not see it that way. It was an invasion. She stiffened and tore herself from his grasp with a strength born of pure terror. "Do not touch me!" she gasped, stumbling back a step. Luke froze, his hand still outstretched. The concern on his face curdled into a look of stunned hurt. He stared at her as if she had struck him. He dropped his arm to his side, his expression closing off, becoming shuttered and distant. Without another word, he opened the cabin door and held it for her, his face a stony mask. Inside, the silence was thick and heavy, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire. They dripped onto the floor, two separate pools of water that did not touch. Evelyn's entire body trembled, but now it was not just from cold. It was from shame and a confusing, tangled mess of other emotions she could not name. She had seen the look on his face. It was not anger. It was something far worse. He lit another lamp, his movement stiff. "You should get out of those wet things," he said, his voice flat. He did not look at her. He went to his own corner of the room, turning his back to her as he pulled a dry shirt from a peg on the wall. Evelyn retreated to her small room, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unfasten the buttons on her dress. She changed into a dry nightgown and robe, her mind racing. When she emerged, he was kneeling by the fire, adding a log. As she walked past, she winced, a sharp pain shooting up from her ankle. He heard the small intake of breath and looked up. His gaze dropped to her foot. "You hurt yourself." It was not a question. Before she could protest, he stood and fetched a small basin, filling it with warm water from the kettle on the stove. He brought it over to the chair she had sunk into and knelt before her. "Let me see it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is nothing. I am fine." "Evelyn?" He said her name for the first time without her title, and the sound of it, so low and serious, silenced her protests. He gently took her foot in his hand. His hands were large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He prodded the swelling flesh of her ankle, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's bruised, maybe a slight sprain. You need to keep off it." His thumb brushed against the side of her foot, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her. To properly examine the joint, he needed to remove her thin house slipper and the boot she had worn beneath it. He slipped the shoe off easily. Then his hands moved to the laces of her high-topped leather boot. The sight of his strong, sun-darkened fingers working at the knot of her bootlace sent a jolt of pure panic through her. It was too intimate. It was an act of disarming, of undressing, in her mind. The image of his hands was replaced by the memory of Arthur's, fumbling with the buttons of her dress in the dark, whispering meaningless words of love. She snatched her foot back as if his touch had burned her. "I am not that kind of bride," she snapped, the words sharp and ugly in the quiet room. It was an accusation, a shield, a desperate cry. She was telling him that she would not be disarmed, would not be made vulnerable, would not be used. Luke froze, his hands hovering in the air where her foot had been. He slowly looked up at her, and the expression on his face broke her heart. The hurt she had seen on the porch was back, but this time it was deeper, etched with a profound and weary sadness. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, echoing sorrow. He rose slowly to his feet, a tall, lonely figure in the flickering firelight. He looked down at her, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, a soft, rough sound full of a pain that seemed ancient. "Then you've never known the kind of man who waits until you ask?" He turned and walked to his own bed on the other side of the room, leaving her alone with her throbbing ankle and the terrible, burning weight of his words. He had not misunderstood her. He had understood her perfectly, and in doing so, had shown her a truth about herself she could not bear to see. She had judged him by the sins of another man. Over the next few days, a heavy, suffocating shame settled over Evelyn. His words replayed in her mind, each time cutting deeper than the last. He did not speak of the incident. He treated her with a distant, formal politeness that was worse than any anger. He was no longer her silent partner. He was a stranger again, and she was the one who had pushed him away. She began to watch him, really watch him, for the first time. She saw him in the early morning light, his back bare to the rising sun as he swung an axe, splitting firewood. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and released with each powerful swing, his body a testament to hard, honest labor. The sight no longer made her afraid. It filled her with a reluctant admiration. She saw him lift the front end of the buckboard to mend a broken axle, a feat of pure strength that left him breathing hard, sweat glistening on his brow. One afternoon, her mare, the one she had driven from town, went lame, its leg caught in a gopher hole. Luke found them on the far side of the pasture. Without a word, he calmed the frightened animal with a low murmur and a gentle hand on its neck. Then he bent, braced himself, and wrapped his arms around the mare's barrel. With a grunt of exertion that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, he lifted the horse's weight just enough for her to free her trapped leg. It was an act of incredible power. Yet it was done with such care, such a quiet focus on easing the animal's suffering. She watched him for hours as he built a new section of fence alone under the hot sun. His movements patient and relentless. He was a part of this land, as silent, as strong, and as enduring as the mountains on the horizon. And he was utterly alone. She saw his loneliness now not as a threat, but as a wound that mirrored her own. The shame inside her began to curdle into something else, something that felt dangerously like compassion. The wall she had built around herself had been breached, not by his force, but by his quiet decency. She found herself wanting to repair the damage she had done, to bridge the chasm of silence she had created. She started with the garden. It was a patch of neglected ground near the house where his brother, Thomas, had once grown vegetables. She found his old tools in a shed and began to work the hard, dry soil, breaking up the clods of earth, pulling weeds, her hands becoming chapped and dirty. It was back-breaking work, but it felt good. It felt like planting a seed of hope in a barren land. One evening, after Luke had returned late from mending the fence, he found a bowl of hot stew waiting for him on the small crate that served as a table beside his bed. A piece of fresh bread was next to it. Tucked under the bowl was a small piece of paper, torn from the edge of a book. On it, in her neat, precise script, were 2 words. "I'm sorry." He stood there for a long time, just looking at the bowl. Evelyn watched from the shadows of her own room, her heart pounding. She saw him pick up the note and read it. His shoulders, which had been slumped with exhaustion, seemed to straighten just a fraction. He did not say anything. He simply ate the stew. And later, when she crept out to retrieve the bowl, it was empty. He never mentioned the note, but something shifted between them. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer a weapon or a wall, but a shared space. He began to talk more, not about her or about them, but about the ranch, about his life. He spoke of his brother, his voice low with a grief that was still raw. "Thomas always said you could tell a man's character by the state of his fences," he said one evening as they sat on opposite sides of the hearth. "He was the one with the head for things. I just had the back for them." He told her about the hard winter that had come after the fire, how the fever had swept through the valley, and how he had felt so helpless, unable to save the one person who mattered most to him. He was not asking for her sympathy. He was simply sharing the weight he carried, treating her, at last, like a partner. One night, she was mending one of his work shirts. The fabric was worn thin at the collar, and as she worked the needle through it, her fingers brushed against something hard beneath the cloth. It was a scar, a pale, puckered line of old tissue just above his collarbone. He was sitting at the table, cleaning a rifle, the lamplight casting his face in shadow. Without thinking, she reached out. Her fingers, hesitant at first, traced the length of the scar. It was a strange, intimate gesture, the first time she had willingly touched him. He went utterly still, his hands freezing on the rifle stock. He looked at her, and his gray eyes were dark with an intensity that made the air grow thick. The space between them crackled with unspoken things. He leaned in slowly, his gaze locked on hers, giving her every chance to pull away. She felt the old, familiar panic begin to rise, a cold wave of fear. Her body tensed. She flinched, but she did not pull away. She held her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat. She stayed, held captive by the question in his eyes. He was so close she could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the tiny lines etched at the corners of his eyes. The moment stretched, simmering, full of a terrifying and beautiful possibility. He saw the flinch. He saw the war being fought in her eyes between her fear and her desire to stay. And because he was a man of his word, a man who waited until she asked, he honored her fear. He pulled back, the motion slow and deliberate, breaking the spell. He gave her a small, sad smile, then turned his attention back to his rifle. leaving her with the ghost of a kiss hanging in the air between them. The rider appeared in the late afternoon, a black-clad figure shimmering in the heat haze that rose from the prairie. As he drew closer, Evelyn saw it was a preacher, a thin, earnest-looking man with a Bible tucked into his saddlebags and a dusty coat that had seen too much sun. He rode a sway-backed mare that looked as weary as he did. Luke met him on the porch, his stance easy but watchful. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the cabin, her hands twisting in her apron, a sudden, inexplicable dread coiling in her stomach. "Brother Calder," the preacher called out, swinging a leg over his saddle. "Heard tell you'd taken a wife. I was riding the circuit and thought I might stop in to offer the Lord's blessing and make the union legal in the eyes of God and man." He beamed at them, a man certain of his welcome, of the righteous necessity of his services. He looked past Luke to Evelyn, his smile broadening. "And this must be the lovely bride. A pleasure, ma'am. Reverend Josiah Mills." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. The word bride struck her like a slap. It was a title she did not feel she had earned, a role she could not play. All the progress she had made, the fragile truce she and Luke had forged, felt suddenly threatened by this well-meaning intruder in the world of rules and expectations he represented. She looked at Luke, a silent, panicked appeal in her eyes. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod, as if to say, "It is your choice." She stepped forward onto the porch, her spine straight, her hands now still at her sides. "You are kind to offer, Reverend Mills," she said, her voice clear and steady, though it cost her every bit of her composure. "But you have been misinformed. Mr. Calder and I are not ready to be married." The preacher's smile faltered. He looked from her cold, polite face to Luke's impassive one, confusion clouding his features. "But the arrangement, I was told a bride was coming from the east." "The lady has spoken," Luke said, his voice quiet but carrying a note of finality that brooked no argument. He stepped forward, taking the preacher's horse by the reins in a gesture that was both helpful and dismissive. "It's a long ride to the next settlement. You are welcome to water your horse and fill your canteen before you go." The offer was polite, but the message was clear. The discussion was over. The preacher, flustered and a little offended, mumbled his thanks, drank deeply from the dipper at the well, and allowed Luke to help him on his way. He rode off in a small cloud of dust, occasionally looking back as if he could still not quite make sense of the encounter. When he was gone, a heavy silence settled over the porch. Evelyn could not bring herself to look at Luke. She had publicly refuted their arrangement, had shamed him. She was sure in front of a man of God. She had asserted her will, and now she waited for the consequences. But Luke simply came and stood beside her, not touching, just looking out at the vast expanse of his land. "He meant well," he said finally. "I know," she whispered. "You did the right thing," he added. "You told the truth." And that was all. He went back to his work mending a harness, leaving her reeling. He was not angry. He had supported her. He had stood by her decision without question, shielding her with his quiet strength. And it was this, more than anything, that began to unravel her. A new kind of guilt took root in her heart in the days that followed. It was no longer the sharp, familiar shame of her past. It was a softer, more aching guilt for the pain she was sure she was causing this good, patient man. And beneath that guilt was something far more terrifying, a deep, pulling current of affection for him. She was drawn to the sound of his voice, low and infrequent as it was. She found herself watching his hands as he worked, noting their strength and their surprising gentleness. She felt a sense of peace settle over her when he was near, a feeling so foreign and so long absent from her life that she did not recognize it at first. It was the feeling of safety. To feel safe with a man was a revelation. To feel drawn to him was a terror. Her body and her heart remembered, with perfect clarity, where such feelings had led her before. They had led to ruin, to whispers, to a hasty and shameful departure from the only home she had ever known. To feel this pull toward Luke felt like a betrayal of the one lesson her pain had taught her, to trust no man, and to trust her own heart least of all. She fought the feeling, burying it under a mountain of work, keeping a careful, polite distance between them. But she could feel it growing in the quiet moments, in the shared silence of an evening, in the way her breath would catch when he turned and looked at her, his gray eyes soft in the lamplight. She could not name it love. That word was too tarnished, too full of lies. But whatever it was, it terrified her. The sky, which had been a placid blue for weeks, began to curdle one evening. Clouds the color of slate rolled in from the west, and a low, ominous rumble echoed in the distance. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Evelyn's arms stand on end. Luke secured the shutters on the cabin and brought the horses into the barn, his movements economical and swift. "This will be a bad one," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. As dusk fell, the storm broke. It was not rain, but a raw, elemental fury. A bolt of lightning, jagged and brilliant white, split the sky, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so violent it shook the cabin to its foundations. The windows rattled, and the lamps flickered. Evelyn, who had always been afraid of storms, felt a primal fear grip her. Another flash lit up the yard, and in that brief, stark illumination, she saw the chickens huddled in their coop, their small structure of wood and wire looking terrifyingly fragile. An image of them, frightened and scattered by the storm, flashed in her mind. It was a foolish, impulsive thought, but she acted on it without hesitation. These small, living things were part of her world now, part of her responsibility. "The chickens," she said, already moving toward the door. "Evelyn, no! Leave them!" Luke's voice was sharp, a command. But she did not listen. She wrenched the door open and ran out into the maelstrom. The wind and rain hit her like a physical blow, plastering her dress to her skin in an instant. She bent her head and pushed forward through the mud, her only thought to secure the latch on the flimsy coop door. She was halfway there when another bolt of lightning struck, this one hitting a tall pine on the ridge above the valley. The world exploded in a white, blinding light, and a sound like the sky being ripped in two. In that split second of unnatural daylight, she saw it, coiled right in her path, seeking the relative warmth of a rock, was a rattlesnake. It was large, its diamond pattern stark against the wet earth. As the thunder crashed around her, its head drew back, its tail a blur of motion, the dry, terrifying buzz cutting through the roar of the storm. Time seemed to stop. She was frozen. A scream caught in her throat. She saw the snake strike, a flash of deadly motion. The world erupted again, this time with the deafening blast of a gunshot right beside her ear. The snake's head vanished in a spray of dirt and blood. Luke was there, his rifle still smoking, his face a pale, stark mask in the flashing lightning. He dropped the gun and grabbed her, his hands seizing her shoulders, spinning her around. "Did it get you?" he yelled, his voice raw with terror. "Answer me, Evelyn! Did it get you?" He did not wait for an answer. His hands moved down her arms, her waist, then down her legs, his palms pressing against the soaked fabric of her skirt. Searching, desperate. The search was frantic, impersonal, the touch of a man checking for a mortal wound. He found nothing. He pulled her against him, his body shielding hers from the storm, and half carried her toward the shelter of the barn. He kicked the heavy door shut behind them, plunging them into a world of near darkness. The sounds of the storm suddenly muffled. The air smelled of hay and animals and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. He let her go, and her legs gave way. She slid down against the rough wall, her body racked with tremors she could not control. Luke knelt in front of her, breathing in ragged gasps, his own adrenaline still coursing through him. "Evelyn," he said, his voice softer now, but still strained. Look at me. Are you bitten?" She could only shake her head, unable to form words. The terror of the last few moments, the lightning, the snake, the gunshot, had shattered the last of her carefully constructed walls. Something inside her broke, and a sob tore its way from her chest. A raw, ragged sound of pure, abject fear. And then it all came pouring out. The tears she had held back for years. The pain she had buried so deep she thought it was gone. She wept, her body shaking with the force of it, her face buried in her hands. She wept for the snake in the storm, but also for everything else. For the life she had lost, for the shame she carried, for the loneliness that was her constant shadow. Luke did not speak. He simply knelt there in the dark, a solid, patient presence, letting the storm inside her run its course. When her sobs finally began to subside into shuddering breaths, he reached out, his hand gently covering hers. "It is all right," he whispered. "You are safe now." His simple words, his gentle touch, were her undoing. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears, and the confession she had carried like a stone in her heart for years finally spilled out. "It is not just the snake," she whispered, her voice a broken thing. It is me. When that preacher came, when he called me a bride, I could not bear it." Her breath hitched. "I am not what you think I am. Luke, I am not untouched." The word came out choked, full of self-loathing. "There was a man back east. He made promises, and I believed him because I was a fool. He ruined me, and then he left me." She finally said the words aloud, the ugly, shameful truth of her past. She looked at his shadowed face, expecting to see disgust, revulsion, or at the very least, pity. She had presented herself as damaged goods. "I was never a real bride," she finished, the whisper fading into the sound of the rain on the roof. "I never can be." Luke was silent for a long moment, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. He was still breathing hard, not from exertion, but from some deep, powerful emotion. When he looked at her, his gray eyes, even in the dim light, were filled with a fierce, aching tenderness that stole her breath. "Then I won't ask for a bride," he said, his voice low and rough. "Just a woman who trusts me." He leaned forward, and his other hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her skin. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss that was a benediction, a promise of safety. Then he lowered his head, and his mouth found hers. It was not a kiss of demand or of passion, but one of profound, solemn acceptance. It was a kiss that said, "I see all of you, and I am not afraid." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers, asking a silent question. In response, she did not pull away. Instead, a small, involuntary sound escaped her lips. A sigh of surrender. It was all the answer he needed. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man so large and strong, he gathered her into his arms and lowered her back into a soft drift of hay. The world narrowed to the two of them, to the scent of the hay and the sound of their breathing mingling with the storm outside. She gasped as her back touched the straw, the old fear a cold, familiar ghost at her side. Her body tensed, preparing for a hurt it knew too well. He paused, sensing her fear. He smoothed the damp hair back from her temple, his touch feather-light. "I am afraid," she whispered, the admission costing her the last of her pride. He looked down at her, his expression one of almost painful reverence. "Then let me undress your doubt," he replied, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her skin and into her soul. He did not move to unfasten her clothes. Instead, he began a slow, patient exploration with his mouth and hands that was a language all its own. He kissed her eyelids, her temples, the corner of her mouth, each touch a question, each lingering moment a reassurance. His hands moved over her, not with greed, but with a kind of wonder. learning the shape of her, the feel of her through the damp cotton of her dress. He was unmaking her, but not in the way Arthur had. Arthur had taken, Luke was giving. He was giving her a new definition of touch, one that was not about power or possession, but about worship. When his mouth finally settled on her breast, a low sound of shock and pleasure escaped her. It was a feeling so intense, so completely focused on her own body's awakening, that it was terrifying in its newness. He unlaced her bodice with slow, deliberate fingers, his gaze never leaving hers, giving her every chance to stop him. She did not. His touch was a revelation. He moved with a reverence that felt holy, as if he were uncovering something precious and long hidden. He was not just touching her skin. He was touching the deep, wounded part of her. And with every kiss, every caress, he was telling her it was not ruined. It was beautiful. When he lowered his head, his mouth trailing a path of fire over her stomach, a tremor went through her entire body. It was a sensation so powerful, so utterly overwhelming, that it short-circuited all her fear, all her shame, replacing it with a pure, undeniable wave of sensation. It was an intimacy she had never imagined, a giving of pleasure so profound it felt like a form of grace. The release, when it came, was not just physical. It was a shattering, a breaking open of everything she had held inside. A sob tore from her throat, but it was not a sob of pain or fear. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated release. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of a prisoner being set free. Afterward, he gathered her close, pulling a coarse wool blanket over them, holding her as her body still trembled with the aftershocks. He held her head against his chest, his hand stroking her hair, and she wept quietly. Not from sadness, but from a sense of catharsis so deep it felt as if she had been washed clean by the storm. Both outside and in, he had undressed her doubt, and in its place, had clothed her in a tenderness she had never known was possible. Evelyn woke to a world that had been washed clean. The morning light that streamed through the small window of her room was pale and pure, filtering through air that smelled of damp earth and pine. The storm had passed, and in its place, a profound stillness had settled over the valley. She lay for a long moment under the rough blanket, listening. The usual sounds were there, the distant lowing of a cow, the crow of the rooster, but they sounded different, clearer, as if she were hearing them for the first time. Something inside her felt different. Too, the constant, tight knot of anxiety that had lived in her stomach for years was gone, replaced by a quiet, humming warmth. She felt new. Not whole, not yet, but as if the broken pieces of her had been carefully gathered and set back into place. The seams still fragile but holding. She felt a lightness in her limbs, an absence of the weary weight she had carried for so long. She rose and dressed, her movements deliberate and quiet. She did not look toward Luke's side of the cabin, where he still slept. She did not need to. His presence was a tangible thing, a warmth that filled the small space. Instead of retreating to her room or busying herself with mending, she walked into the main room, which served as their kitchen, and began to make breakfast. She moved with a newfound purpose, building up the fire in the stove, slicing thick pieces of salt pork, and mixing batter for johnny cakes. The familiar domestic actions felt different this morning. They were not a duty performed to earn her keep, but an offering, a quiet declaration. The sizzle of the pork in the hot cast-iron skillet was a cheerful, defiant sound in the morning silence. When Luke finally emerged, the coffee was already boiling, its rich aroma filling the air. He stopped in the doorway, his hair damp and tousled from sleep, and simply watched her for a moment. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, but a quiet calm radiated from him. Their eyes met across the room, and in that single glance, everything was said. They did not speak of the night in the barn. They did not need to. Words would have been too clumsy, too coarse to describe the fragile, sacred thing that had been forged between them in the storm. An unspoken covenant had been made. He came and sat at the table, and she served him a plate piled high with pork and johnny cakes, then poured him a mug of coffee. She sat opposite him with her own plate, and they ate in a silence that was not empty but full. It was a silence of shared understanding, of a journey taken together in the dark. When he was finished, he looked at her, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, and the simple words were enough. In the weeks that followed, the fragile newness between them began to strengthen, to take root. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their partnership now easy and natural. The air, however, was not entirely peaceful. Word began to travel through the valley, carried by lone riders passing from one isolated ranch to another. A band of outlaws, men made desperate by a hard winter and their own bad character, had been harassing the outlying homesteads. They were not just stealing cattle, they were growing bolder, more violent, leaving a trail of fear in their wake. Luke began to ride out more often, his rifle always resting in the scabbard on his saddle. He joined with other ranchers, men like himself who were determined to protect their land and their families. They took turns patrolling the long, empty stretches of the valley, watching for any sign of the riders. But he never left Evelyn alone for long. If he had to be gone overnight, he would ride the extra hours to take her to the nearest neighbor, a stern-faced but kindly woman named Martha, whose husband was also part of the patrol. He refused to leave her alone on the isolated ranch. His protectiveness was a quiet, constant presence, a shield she did not know she needed until she felt its weight. One afternoon, the mail rider, a young boy on a fast pony, made a detour to the ranch. He carried a single letter for her. Evelyn's heart seized when she saw the familiar, spidery handwriting of her aunt's companion. She took the letter with a trembling hand and waited until the boy had ridden off before she broke the wax seal. The news was stark and delivered without sentiment. Her Aunt Mildred had passed away in her sleep 2 weeks prior. The woman wrote that in sorting through her aunt's affairs. A letter had arrived. It was from a man in Baltimore, a Mr. Arthur Vance. Inquiring as to Evelyn's whereabouts, he had heard she had gone west and seemed most anxious to locate her. The companion had, of course, not replied, but felt Evelyn ought to be aware. The letter fell from her fingers. Her aunt was gone, the last tie to her old life, a tie she had often resented but which had been a kind of anchor, was now severed. And Arthur was looking for her. The name, which she had not allowed herself to even think for 2 years, was a poisoned dart. Why now? What could he possibly want after so thoroughly destroying her? The old fear, the feeling of being hunted, of having no safe place to hide, returned with a vengeance. She stood there for a long time, the letter at her feet, the vast, empty prairie seeming to press in on her. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, she bent down, picked up the letter, and carried it to the stove. She opened the firebox and dropped the piece of paper onto the glowing embers. She watched as the edges curled and blackened, the words of her past turning to smoke and ash. It was an act of defiance, but it did not stop the shaking of her hands. She was a woman without a past now, adrift in a new life, and a ghost was trying to find her. The ghost arrived a week later, not as a letter, but in the flesh. It was a hot, still afternoon. Luke was mending a harness on the porch, and Evelyn was hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts. She heard the sound of riders first, a sloppy, boisterous group, their laughter loud and coarse on the quiet air. 4 men rode into the yard. They were not ranchers. They were drifters, their clothes ragged, their faces unshaven, and the smell of cheap whiskey preceded them. They reined in their horses, their eyes moving over the small, tidy ranch with a mixture of contempt and appraisal. Luke had already risen to his feet, his body positioned between the men and the cabin door. his hands loose at his sides but his posture radiating a dangerous stillness. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice level. The leader, a big man with a florid face and mean little eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Just looking for a drink of water, maybe something stronger, if you have it, and maybe a hot meal for me and my boys." His eyes slid past Luke and landed on Evelyn. His gaze was insolent, stripping her bare. Evelyn froze, her hand still clutching a wet shirt. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over her. She knew one of them, not the leader, but a smaller, ferret-faced man who hung back, his eyes widening in shock as he looked at her. She remembered him from Baltimore. He had been one of Arthur's friends, one of the group who had been there the night Arthur had bragged of his conquest, their laughter echoing in her memory like the sound of breaking glass. The man's surprise quickly morphed into a greasy, triumphant smile. He spurred his horse forward a few steps and pointed a grimy finger at her. "Well, I'll be," he sneered, his voice carrying across the yard. "Look what we have here. Fancy Evelyn Whitmore from Baltimore. Didn't ever figure to see you in a place like this. Thought you were too good for the dirt." The word struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt and narrow to a single, roaring pinpoint of sound. Her name, her city, her past, dragged out into the harsh Montana sunlight for all to see. She felt the color drain from her face, felt the old, suffocating shame rise up and choke her. She was impaled by the words, naked and exposed. Luke did not turn to look at her. He did not ask for an explanation. His entire focus remained on the men, but she saw the muscles in his back and shoulders bunch and tighten. She saw his hands clench slowly into fists. The ferret-faced man was enjoying himself. "What's the matter, Evelyn?" he taunted, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Cat got your tongue, or did your new man here not know what kind of company you used to keep?" That was as far as he got. Luke moved. It was not a rush, but a blur of controlled, deliberate violence. He took 2 long strides and his right fist shot out, connecting with the man's jaw with a sick, wet sound. The man flew backward off his horse, landing in a heap in the dust, unconscious before he hit the ground. The other 3 men stared, momentarily stunned into sobriety by the sudden, brutal efficiency of the attack. The leader's hand started to move toward the pistol on his hip. "I wouldn't," Luke said, his voice a low, deadly growl. He took a step toward them, and the raw, murderous fury in his eyes was enough to make the big man's hand freeze. "Take your friend and get off my land. If I ever see any of you again, I will not be so polite." There was no question that he meant it. He looked like a man who would kill them all without a moment's hesitation. Scrambling, the men dismounted, hauled their unconscious companion over his saddle like a sack of grain, and rode off at a gallop, not looking back. The silence they left behind was vast and terrible. The only sounds were the buzz of flies and the whisper of the wind in the grass. Luke stood over the spot where the man had fallen, his chest rising and falling heavily, his knuckles bleeding. Finally, he turned and looked at Evelyn. She was still standing by the clothesline, rooted to the spot, her face as white as the sheet she still clutched in her hand. The shame was a physical thing, a filthy tide that threatened to drown her. He had seen, he had heard, he knew. She tried to pull away from him, not physically, but emotionally. She retreated behind the old walls, the ones she thought had been dismantled. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I bring trouble. I do not deserve your protection." It was the old script, the one she knew by heart. She was tainted. She was trouble. She was unworthy. He walked toward her, his face grim, his gray eyes burning with an intensity that stopped her cold. He came to stand in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of dust on his eyelashes. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the wet shirt from her nerveless fingers and toss it into the basket. Then he cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low and fierce, Look at me." She reluctantly lifted her eyes to his. He pinned her with his gaze, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "You gave me your truth in the barn. That is all I have ever wanted. That man's filth has nothing to do with you or with me." He shook his head. A small, sharp movement. "His words do not change who you are, not to me." His unwavering belief in her, his absolute refusal to let her shame win, was a force more powerful than any blow. It shattered her defenses more completely than his passion in the barn. Tears welled in her eyes, not of shame, but of a raw, overwhelming gratitude. That night, after the silence had settled back over the cabin, she went to him. He was sitting by the cold hearth, cleaning the rifle he had not had to use, his bandaged knuckles a stark white in the moonlight. She knelt before him and, taking his wounded hand, gently brought it to her lips. Pressing a kiss to the bruised knuckles, he went still, watching her, his eyes dark pools of shadow. "Teach me again," she whispered, her voice husky. She looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, unwavering certainty. "But this time, show me who I am now." It was not a plea, it was a demand to be seen not as the broken girl from Baltimore, but as the woman she was becoming here, with him. She was no longer a passive victim of her past or a grateful recipient of his kindness. She was his partner, in every sense of the word. She rose, pulling him to his feet. She kissed him first, a kiss that was not hesitant or questioning, but full of a fierce, desperate hunger. It was a kiss of claiming, of possession. She guided his hand to the laces of her dress, her eyes holding his, a silent challenge and a profound invitation. Their passion that night was not the gentle, healing exploration of the storm. It was a storm in itself, a wild and elemental thing that broke across the plains of their small cabin. It was fierce and hungry, a collision of two lonely souls who had finally found an anchor in a brutal world. And this time, when her cries echoed against the log walls, they were not the sobs of release or the gasps of fear. They were the moans of pure, unadulterated need. Word of the woman at the Calder Ranch spread, not on the bitter winds of gossip, but in the warm currents of gratitude. It began when Martha, their closest neighbor, went into a difficult labor during a fearsome thunderstorm. Her husband half mad with fear, and the midwife stuck on the other side of a flooded creek. Luke had ridden through the deluge to fetch the doctor, leaving Evelyn alone with the terrified couple. She had never witnessed a birth, but she had read books, and her calm, steady presence was an anchor in the chaotic little cabin. She boiled water. She spoke in low, soothing tones, and when the moment came, she guided Martha with a firm, sure hand, her own fear locked away behind a wall of grim necessity. When the doctor finally arrived, soaked and weary, it was to the sound of a healthy baby's cry and the sight of Evelyn, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes shining, holding the swaddled infant. After that, the whispers about Calder's pride died down, replaced by murmurs of respect. When old Jedediah came down with a lung fever, it was Evelyn who rode over daily with a pot of hot, nourishing broth. When the church roof was damaged in a hailstorm, she was among the women who organized the mending and the meals for the men doing the labor. She began to attend the small Sunday service, not out of a need for absolution, but because it was a place where the scattered, lonely people of the valley came together. She would sit quietly in the back pew, and Luke, who had not set foot in the church since his brother's funeral, would stand outside, leaning against a cottonwood, waiting for her. He was not a man for sermons, but he was a man who stood by his woman, and the whole valley saw it. They were no longer just Calder and his mail-order arrangement. They were Luke and Evelyn, a fixed point in the landscape. Their life at the ranch had settled into a rhythm of deep, quiet intimacy. They were partners in every sense of the word, the days filled with shared work, the nights with a passion that was both a healing balm and a fierce, declarative fire. One evening, as they sat at the table, Luke spread out a map of the valley. He had been talking for weeks about expanding their herd, about buying a neighboring section of land that had good water rights. "The bank in Miles City has agreed to the loan," he said, his finger tracing the boundary of the new property. "The papers will be ready next week." He paused, then looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "The deed will be drawn up in both our names, Calder and Whitmore." Evelyn stared at him, the words taking a moment to register. Her name, on a legal deed. It was one thing to share his home, his work, his bed. It was another thing entirely to be named as his legal partner, an owner of the land, a co-creator of the future he was building. It was an act of trust so profound, so absolute. It stole her breath. It was a public declaration that she was not a temporary resident or a woman of questionable status. She was the co-owner of this land, this life. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She was overwhelmed by the sheer, unexpected weight of his faith in her. He was not just loving her in the dark of night. He was honoring her in the bright light of day, integrating her into the very fabric of his existence in a way that left no room for doubt. She could not speak. She could only reach across the table and lay her hand over his, her touch conveying all the gratitude that her voice could not. But the past was not a ghost that could be banished by good deeds or legal documents. It was a patient predator, and it had been tracking her across a continent. It arrived in the form of a shiny black buggy, a vehicle so out of place in the dusty ranch yard that it looked as if it had fallen from another planet. 2 men sat on the seat. One was the town sheriff, a portly, slow-moving man named Brody with a drooping mustache and wary eyes. The other man was Arthur Vance. Evelyn felt the world stop. It was as if the sun had frozen in the sky, the air turning to ice in her lungs. He looked older, fuller in the face, but it was him. The same polished shoes, the same expensive wool coat, the same air of easy, confident superiority. He saw her standing on the porch and smiled, a cold, predatory smile that did not reach his eyes. Luke stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his body instantly tense. He saw the buggy, saw the sheriff, and then he saw the man beside him. He did not know his name, but he recognized the type. He walked slowly toward the porch, positioning himself between Evelyn and the visitors. A silent, immovable wall. "Sheriff," Luke said, his voice a low rumble. "What brings you all the way out here?" Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably on the buggy seat. He cleared his throat. "Luke, ma'am." He gave Evelyn a curt nod. "This here is Mr. Arthur Vance, from Baltimore. He has come to me with a legal matter." Arthur swung down from the buggy, brushing a piece of dust from his sleeve. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who had never known a moment of physical hardship in his life. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Evelyn, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, the sound that had once haunted her dreams. "You have led me on quite a chase, but then you always did have a flair for the dramatic." "She does not know you," Luke said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Oh, I assure you, she does," Arthur replied, his smile widening. He held up the papers. "You see, Sheriff, Miss Whitmore and I had an understanding, an agreement to be married. She accepted my proposal, and in doing so, accepted a number of expensive gifts, including a family heirloom, a sapphire necklace, as a token of our betrothal. Then she vanished, taking the necklace with her. I have come to reclaim my property, and my fiancé." The accusation hung in the air, stunning in its audacity, its brilliant, malevolent cruelty. It was a lie, but it was a lie constructed from a sliver of truth. He had given her gifts. He had whispered of marriage. The necklace, a pretty but inexpensive trinket, had been a birthday present, not a betrothal gift. But how could she prove that? It was her word, the word of a mail-order bride, against his, the word of a wealthy gentleman from the East. "That is a lie," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but clear. She would not cower, not in front of Luke. Arthur feigned a look of deep hurt. "My dear, your passions have always been your undoing. Sheriff, I have here a sworn affidavit, signed by 2 witnesses, attesting to our engagement, and a jeweler's receipt for the necklace in question. I am pressing charges of theft, and I am here to exercise my legal right to reclaim the woman who promised herself to me." Sheriff Brody looked from Arthur's confident face to Evelyn's pale, shocked one. He was a simple man who believed in the authority of paper and the word of important-looking men. "Ma'am," he said, his tone heavy with suspicion, "this is a serious charge. Do you have this necklace?" I sold it," Evelyn stammered, "to pay for my passage west. It was a gift. It was mine to sell." The sheriff's face hardened. In his eyes, her admission was a confession of guilt. "Luke, I do not want any trouble, but I have a legal complaint here. I will have to take Miss Whitmore into town for questioning." The thought of being locked in the town's small, filthy jail cell, of being subjected to the humiliation of a public accusation, was a nightmare made real. It was everything she had run from, come back to claim her. Luke took a half-step forward, his hands clenched into fists, a low growl starting in his chest. "You will not lay a hand on her." "Now, Luke, do not make this difficult," the sheriff warned, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. But Evelyn stepped forward, placing a hand on Luke's arm. Violence would solve nothing. It would only make them look more guilty. She looked at the sheriff, her chin lifted. "I will come with you," she said, "but I am not guilty of these charges." Luke looked down at her, his eyes blazing with a helpless fury. She saw in them his desire to tear these men apart, but she also saw his understanding. He turned his gaze back to the sheriff. "You will not put her in a cell," he said, his voice a command, not a request. "She will stay at the hotel, and I will stand surety for her. I need 2 days. 2 days for what?" Brody asked. "To prove he is a liar," Luke said, his eyes locking with Arthur's. After a tense negotiation, the sheriff agreed. Evelyn packed a small bag, her hands moving with a numb, mechanical precision as she climbed into the back of the buggy. Arthur looked at Luke with a triumphant smirk. "You cannot win, rancher," he said softly. "She was mine long before she was ever yours." Luke did not reply. He simply watched the buggy disappear down the trail, his face carved from stone. Then he turned and strode into the cabin. He went to her room, to the small wooden chest where she kept her few possessions. He opened it and began to search. He found what he was looking for at the bottom, a small, ribbon-tied bundle of letters. The letters Arthur had written her, full of his false promises and flowery prose, the proof of his lies. He saddled his fastest horse, a powerful buckskin, strapping a bedroll and supplies behind the saddle. The circuit judge, a man known for his fairness and his dislike of Sheriff Brody's methods, was in Helena, a hard 2-day ride away. A storm was brewing in the mountains, but he did not hesitate. He swung into the saddle and rode out, his face set in a grim, determined line. The ride was brutal. He pushed the horse to its limit, taking a treacherous shortcut through the mountains to save time. The storm broke while he was navigating a high pass, turning the trail into a slick river of mud. In the driving rain and the darkness, his horse slipped, its legs going out from under it. Luke was thrown, his head striking a rock as he fell. He lay there for a long time, the rain washing over him, before he managed to pull himself back into the saddle, his head throbbing, a wave of dizziness threatening to overwhelm him. He had to keep going. He returned 3 days later, slumped over his horse, which was walking with a lame, exhausted gait. Evelyn, who had been pacing the small hotel room like a caged animal, saw him from her window. She ran down the stairs and into the street, her heart seizing with terror at the sight of him. He was pale beneath his tan, a dark bruise spreading from his temple, and his shirt was caked with dried blood and mud. He had a raging fever. They got him into a room, and Evelyn took over. She sent for the doctor, but she did not wait for him. She knew the remedies of the prairie. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of willow bark tea between his chapped lips, and sat by his bedside, a constant, vigilant presence. The judge had read the letters and dismissed Arthur's charges, sending him packing with a stern warning about perjury. Luke had won, but now, in this small, stuffy room, a much more primal battle was being fought. He tossed and turned, lost in the haze of the fever, muttering words she could not understand. She was terrified. The thought of losing him was a physical agony, a cold, sharp blade twisting in her gut. This man, this quiet, patient rancher, had become the center of her world. Without him, the vast, empty landscape of her life would be unbearable. She thought of his strength, his kindness, his unwavering faith in her. She thought of the future they were supposed to build together, the name on the deed, the life they had just begun. Leaning over him, she smoothed the damp hair from his forehead, her own tears falling onto his face. "Luke," she whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "Please do not leave me. If I lose you, I have nothing." His eyes flickered open, but they were not clear. They were clouded with fever, looking at her but seeing something far away. He tried to speak, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "Always," he muttered. "You were always mine, from the minute you refused my wagon seat." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had seen her, from the very beginning, through all her pride and fear and foolishness. He had seen the woman she was meant to be. His long wait had not been mere patience. It had been a certainty, a quiet, unshakable knowledge that their souls were meant to be entwined. A sob escaped her, a sound of both heartbreak and profound, earth-shattering love. She took his hand, the one that had held her, protected her, and built her a home, and pressed it to her lips, weeping as she had not wept since the night in the barn. The fever broke near dawn. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time in 2 days. He was weak, his body aching, but he was himself. The first thing he saw was Evelyn, asleep in the chair beside his bed, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hand still clutching his. He squeezed her fingers gently. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, and a slow, beautiful smile of pure relief spread across her face. She slid from the chair and knelt beside the bed, her bare feet peeking out from under the hem of her dress. She looked into his tired, clear eyes, and all the fear, all the doubt, all the remnants of her past were gone, burned away in the crucible of the last few days. She knew who she was now. She was his. "Then marry me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, a small, decisive movement. "No preacher, no paper, just us." The spring that followed was a season of resurrection. The land, long dormant under the hard fist of winter, began to breathe again. Patches of pale green grass appeared on the hillsides, and the stoic cottonwoods along the creek began to bud. Their branches fuzzed with the promise of new leaves. It was a time for rebuilding, and for the first time, the work of the ranch was not a solitary burden for Luke or a set of duties for Evelyn, but a shared act of creation. They worked from sunup to sundown, moving with the easy, unspoken rhythm of two people who have learned the landscape of each other's souls. They whitewashed the interior walls of the cabin, the bright, clean scent of lye and lime chasing away the last of the winter's shadows. The small, dark house began to feel lighter, more open, as if it too were taking a deep, cleansing breath. Evelyn found a bolt of cheerful yellow calico at the general store and sewed curtains for the windows, a small touch of color that transformed the cabin from a shelter into a home. The lambing season began, and this time, when a ewe was in distress, Evelyn did not turn away. She was there beside Luke in the barn, her sleeves rolled up, her face set in a determined line. She learned to gently turn a breech lamb, to clear its airway with a swipe of her finger, and to coax a weak newborn to nurse. The raw, elemental nature of it no longer felt base to her. It felt sacred. It was the messy, beautiful, undeniable pulse of life itself, and she was a part of it. She would emerge from the barn, her hands and dress stained, her body aching with a good exhaustion, and meet Luke's proud, quiet gaze. And in that look, she felt more like a lady than she ever had in the drawing rooms of Baltimore. One clear, cool morning, they rode out to the far side of the valley, to a high point that overlooked the entire ranch. Luke carried a small sapling, its roots bundled in a damp piece of burlap. It was a young cottonwood, barely a whip of a tree, but its leaves were a vibrant, hopeful green. This was his favorite spot, Luke said, his voice low. Thomas, he used to say you could see the whole world from up here. Together, they dug a hole in the rocky soil. Evelyn held the sapling steady while Luke carefully filled the hole, tamping the earth down around the fragile roots. They did not say many words. They did not need to. The act of planting the tree was a prayer, a memorial, and a promise. It was an honoring of the past, of the brother whose loss had carved such a hollow in Luke's heart. And it was a planting of their own future, a living testament to the new life that was taking root in this valley, a life they were building together, as they stood side by side, looking out at the sprawling land that was their home. Evelyn slipped her hand into Luke's, and his fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. Their wedding day arrived not with a peal of bells or a grand announcement, but as gently as the morning mist rising from the creek. There was no preacher, no church filled with onlookers. There was only the vast, silent cathedral of the Montana sky and the whispering benediction of the wind in the cottonwood trees. Their only witnesses were Martha and her husband, Jed, their faces weathered and kind. Their presence a quiet affirmation of the community Evelyn had earned her place in. She wore no veil, no corset, no complicated gown. She wore a simple dress of pale blue linen she had sewn herself, its lines clean and unadorned. She had woven a few early wildflowers into her hair, and as she walked from the cabin to the grove of trees where Luke was waiting, she was barefoot, the cool, damp earth, a living thing beneath her feet. It was a deliberate choice, a final casting off of the artifice of her old life. She was no longer a woman in kid gloves, separated from the world. She was a woman of this land, grounded and free. Luke was waiting for her, his back against the trunk of the oldest cottonwood. He had on a clean shirt, his hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved that morning, the line of his jaw sharp and clear. When he saw her walking toward him, a look of such profound, reverent love came into his eyes that it made her heart ache. There were no long, practiced vows, standing before their friends, with the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. They turned to each other. "Evelyn," Luke said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. He took her hands in his. "You came here and shared my silence. You taught me how to live again. My heart, this land, this life, it is all yours. It always was." Tears streamed freely down Evelyn's cheeks, but she was smiling, a radiant, watery smile. "Luke," she whispered, her voice thick but strong, "you waited for me. You saw me when I could not see myself. You gave me a home not just on this earth, but inside my own skin. I am yours, completely and without fear." And with those simple, honest words, they were married. Jed solemnly shook Luke's hand, and Martha embraced Evelyn, her hug fierce and welcoming. They shared a simple meal of roasted chicken and fresh bread under the trees, and as the sun began to dip toward the mountains, their friends rode home, leaving the newly married couple in the quiet twilight of their own valley. That night, a full moon rose, huge and silver, bathing the landscape in an ethereal glow. A profound sense of peace had settled over Evelyn, a feeling of rightness so deep it hummed in her bones. She took Luke by the hand, a new, bold confidence in her touch. "Come with me," she said, her voice a low murmur. She led him not to the cabin, but down the gentle slope toward the creek. It was the same creek that had nearly claimed her in the storm, the same place where she had been saved. It was no longer a place of fear, but a place of transformation. The water, now calm and clear, gurgled over the smooth stones, its surface a shattered mirror of moonlight. She stopped at the water's edge and turned to face him, her eyes luminous in the darkness. She slowly raised her hands and began to unlace the front of her simple linen dress. "Undress me here," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying in the still night air. "Let the whole world hear I belong to no one but you." It was the ultimate reclamation. She was not being taken, not being used, not being possessed. She was giving. She was choosing. She was declaring her own sovereignty and bestowing it, freely and joyfully, upon him. He watched her, his breath caught in his throat, his face a mask of awe. He reached out and his hands, calloused and strong, covered hers, stilling their movement. He gently pushed her hands aside and, with an infinite, worshipful tenderness, he finished the task himself, his fingers slowly unfastening the laces, parting the soft fabric. He slid the dress from her shoulders, and it pooled at her feet like a sigh. She stood before him in the moonlight, her skin glowing, her body a pale, beautiful statue. She was not a ruined thing. She was a masterpiece. He shed his own clothes in a few swift movements and followed her as she waded into the cool, clear water. It swirled around their ankles, then their knees, then their thighs. The current, a gentle caress. He came to her in the middle of the stream and pulled her against him, his wet skin against hers. The shock of the cold water and the heat of their bodies a dizzying contrast. He kissed her, and it was a kiss of fierce, unrestrained hunger, a celebration of the love that had been so hard won. It was a kiss of homecoming, of a long journey's end. In the middle of that deep, consuming kiss, a sound bubbled up from Evelyn's chest, a sound he had never heard from her before. It was a laugh, a pure, free, joyous laugh that mingled with the sound of the running water and echoed in the silent valley. It was the sound of a soul set free. And as she laughed, a single, hot tear slid from Luke's eye and traced a path through the water on her neck. He buried his face in the curve of her shoulder, and his body shook with a silent, racking sob. He was weeping, weeping for the end of his loneliness, for the beautiful, impossible gift of this woman in his arms, for the profound, overwhelming relief of a heart that had finally found its harbor. In the moonlight, surrounded by the living water, their bodies met, a fierce and tender union, her laughter and his tears mingling in the sacred silence. A few months later, a letter arrived from the judge in Helena. It was a brief, formal note to inform them that a Mr. Arthur Vance had been arrested and convicted in Denver on several counts of fraud and embezzlement. Justice, it seemed, had its own slow, inevitable current. Evelyn read the letter, a flicker of the old pain stirring for a moment, and then it was gone, replaced by a calm, quiet pity for a man so empty he had to feed on the lives of others. The news was a postscript to a chapter of her life that was now firmly and forever closed. That evening, she sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pen. She did not write to the judge or to anyone in Baltimore. She wrote a letter to a ghost. To the girl who was once me, she wrote, "You were never ruined. You were just wounded. There is a difference. To be wounded is to be alive, and to be alive is to be able to heal. You were never wrong to want love. It is the most natural, most human desire of all. You were only wrong to believe that love was a thing that could be stolen from you. It cannot. It can only be given. And one day, a man will come who does not try to take anything, but who simply waits for you to give. Do not be afraid of him. He is your future. He is your home. She folded the letter, tucked it into the small wooden box that held her mother's locket, and placed it on the high shelf of the wardrobe. She was not burying her past. She was making peace with it. The final scene of their story was not an ending, but a beginning. They rode out together across the prairie on Luke's big buckskin horse, checking the fences on the new section of land that was now theirs. A bank of dark, bruised-looking storm clouds gathered on the mountains behind them, a reminder of the hardships they had endured, of the storms that would inevitably come again. But ahead of them, the sun broke through, spilling across the plains in a great, golden wave, illuminating the endless, hopeful expanse of the horizon. Evelyn sat behind Luke, her arms wrapped securely around his waist, her cheek resting against the solid warmth of his back. She was no longer moving toward an unknown fate. She was riding home. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.